There are people who are not born to live quietly. They arrive in the world carrying something heavy, long before they understand what it is. Not a crown, not a title, but a responsibility that does not ask for permission. A responsibility that waits patiently until the moment silence becomes more dangerous than speaking, and standing still becomes more costly than standing tall. Before any name is spoken, before any battle is remembered, there is always a long silence. A silence that settles over a community like dust. People learn to move carefully inside it. They learn which words are safe, which questions should not be asked, which truths are better swallowed than spoken aloud. Over time, that silence begins to feel normal, necessary, even. It is called survival. But silence has a way of growing teeth. It starts small, a boundary moved without consent, a rule rewritten by someone who does not know the land. A promise explained away as misunderstanding. Nothing dramatic, nothing that seems worth dying for. And that is how it survives, by convincing good people that today is not the day to resist. This story begins in that kind of silence. It begins in a place where land is more than soil, where memory lives in the ground, and where ancestors are not figures of the past, but companions in the present. It begins among people who understood that dignity is not something granted by others, but something carried, even when carrying it becomes painful. There was a woman in that silence who listened carefully. She listened not only to what was being said, but to what was slowly disappearing. She noticed how people lowered their eyes more often, how hesitation replaced confidence, how fear learned to dress itself as patience. She did not wake up one morning planning to change history. She did not search for power or recognition or legend. What she felt was simpler and heavier than that. She felt the quiet warning that comes when a line is being crossed, and no one wants to admit it yet. This is not a story about victory or defeat. It is a story about posture, about the moment a human being decides whether the next generation will inherit fear or inherit the memory of someone who refused to bend. If you stay until the end of this story, you will not just meet a woman from the past. You will understand why, even now, long after her name was nearly lost, her way of standing still matters to all of us who are still here. The land that shaped her did not offer comfort. It offered memory. Long before the outside world began to press in, the people of the Herero lived with an understanding that land was not something you owned. It was something you belonged to. Every path carried a story. Every grazing ground held the footsteps of ancestors. The earth itself was a living record, remembering those who had cared for it and those who had sworn to protect it. To grow up, Herero was to grow up knowing that you were never alone. The dead were not gone. They listened, they watched, they measured the living, not by wealth or noise, but by whether they honored what had been handed down. In that world, women were not invisible. They were the keepers of rhythm and continuity. They carried the memory of births and losses. They knew which songs belonged to mourning and which belonged to celebration. They understood when silence meant patience and when silence meant danger. A woman who paid attention could feel the health of the community long before any council gathered. This was the soul that shaped Kaipkire. She did not grow up being told that her life would be easy. She was taught something far more demanding. She was taught that dignity was not a reward, but a duty. That survival without honor was a form of slow erasure. That every generation was a bridge, not a destination. As a young woman, she learned to read people the way others read tracks in the dust. She noticed when elders spoke more carefully than before, when conversations ended too quickly, when familiar rules were explained away instead of upheld. These were not dramatic moments. They were quiet shifts, almost polite in their arrival. But Kaipkire understood what quiet shifts could become. She watched how fear softened voices, how confidence was slowly traded for caution, how people began to tell themselves that endurance was the same thing as acceptance. She did not argue. She listened. She stored these moments away, knowing that understanding always comes before action. The land taught her patience. Her community taught her responsibility. And her ancestors, though unseen, taught her something deeper still, that one day, someone would have to decide whether the ground beneath them would remain sacred or become negotiable. At the time, Kaipkire did not know that person would be her. But the land knew. The outside world did not arrive with drums or declarations. It arrived quietly, wearing the language of opportunity. At first, it was trade. Goods exchanged with polite smiles. New objects that carried unfamiliar value. Words spoken carefully, translated just enough to sound harmless. Nothing that demanded resistance. Nothing that seemed to threaten the ground beneath people's feet. But the change did not stop there. New rules began to follow the goods. New expectations followed the smiles. Agreements appeared that felt one-sided only after they had already been accepted. Lines were drawn that had never existed before, and those lines were explained as progress. What was being taken was not announced. It was suggested. The people were told that this was how the world worked now, that adaptation was wisdom, that those who questioned too much were clinging to the past. Slowly, the familiar order began to feel outdated, even to those who had lived by it their entire lives. Kaipkire watched these changes with care. She noticed how elders paused before speaking, measuring their words as if something invisible were listening. She noticed how disputes that once would have been settled within the community were now deferred, delayed, redirected. Authority was shifting, not by force, but by habit. The most dangerous changes were the ones that could be explained away. Land was still there, but access to it was questioned. Customs were still practiced, but now they were labeled informal, unofficial, replaceable. People were still free, but increasingly told what freedom should look like. Kaipkire saw something else as well. She saw how women felt the pressure first. When families were unsettled, it was women who absorbed the strain. When uncertainty grew, it was women who adjusted, who compensated, who kept things from breaking apart. And she saw how this quiet labor was mistaken for consent. Silence was becoming a currency. The longer people remained quiet, the more they were told that everything was fine, that patience was strength, that resistance would only make things worse. Over time, that message sank in, not because it was true, but because it was repeated often enough to feel unavoidable. Kaipkire did not raise her voice. Not yet. She understood that before a community can resist, it must first recognize what is being lost. And she could feel that recognition forming. Slowly, painfully, like a shadow growing longer at the end of the day. The world outside had knocked. The door had been opened. And something precious had already stepped across the threshold. Silence does not announce when it becomes dangerous. It simply settles in deeper. What began as patience slowly turned into habit. What was once restraint became routine. People learned how to survive inside smaller and smaller spaces without realizing the walls were closing in. Each compromise was justified. Each hesitation explained as wisdom. Each lowered voice praised as maturity. Kaipkire watched this transformation with growing concern. She saw how caution began to shape behavior more than conviction. How people checked their surroundings before speaking truths they once shared freely. How stories were shortened, how memories were softened so they would not disturb the present. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as carefulness. And carefulness, when left unchallenged, can become permission. The community was not collapsing. That was the problem. Life continued. Children were born. Cattle still moved across familiar ground. Songs were still sung, but something essential was thinning, like breath at high altitude. The people were surviving, but they were no longer standing at full height. Kaipkire understood what many did not yet want to name. When silence is rewarded, it teaches the next generation that quiet obedience is the price of safety. It teaches children which questions will bring trouble and which will bring praise. Over time, fear stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like common sense. She saw how disagreement began to fracture relationships, how those who asked uncomfortable questions were labeled difficult, reckless, or unrealistic. Unity was redefined as agreement, and agreement was increasingly shaped by forces that did not share the community's memory or values. This was not conquest by violence. It was erosion by normalization. Kaipkire felt the weight of an unspoken truth settling on her shoulders. If this continued, resistance would no longer be possible because people would forget that resistance had ever been an option. They would inherit limits they did not choose and defend them as if they were natural laws. She did not accuse. She did not confront. She listened longer. And in that listening, something hardened into clarity. Silence was no longer neutral. It was no longer protective. It had crossed a line and become a threat, not only to the present, but to the memory of who the Herero had been. Kaipkire understood that before any outward action could take place, an inner boundary had to be drawn, a point beyond which silence would no longer be carried with dignity, but with regret. That boundary was close now, and once crossed, there would be no return to quiet. There is no single moment when a person becomes something else. It happens quietly, after too many small moments stack on top of one another. For Kaipkire, the change did not come with a declaration. It came with repetition. The same concerns dismissed again and again. The same warnings softened until they sounded like overreaction. The same assurances offered without proof. Each time, she told herself to wait. Each time, she listened a little longer than was comfortable, until waiting itself began to feel like betrayal. She reached a point where the question was no longer whether change was happening. That was undeniable. The question was whether she could live with herself if she continued to watch it unfold without stepping forward. That question followed her everywhere. It sat beside her in silence. It walked with her across familiar ground that now felt uncertain. Kaipkire understood something deeply human in that moment. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. It had become a choice, and not a harmless one. It was a choice that would shape what children learn to accept. A choice that would decide whether fear or memory would guide the future. She knew what standing up would cost. Isolation, danger, being misunderstood by those she loved. She knew that once she crossed this line, she would no longer belong fully to the safety of ordinary life. Leaders do not get to step back into anonymity when things grow difficult. And still, she moved forward. Not because she believed she could control the outcome, but because she could no longer accept the direction things were moving in. She chose to carry the weight that others were quietly setting down. She chose to speak where silence had grown too comfortable. This was the moment Kaipkire stopped being a witness. She did not announce herself as a leader. Others did that later. What she did was simpler and more frightening. She allowed herself to be seen as someone who would not pretend everything was fine. Someone willing to name what was being lost, even if naming it made her a target. There was no celebration in this decision, only clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when all easier paths have been exhausted, when the cost of standing still outweighs the fear of stepping forward, when a person accepts that life will no longer be measured by comfort, but by conscience. From that moment on, Kaipkire could not return to the role of observer. The path ahead was uncertain, but turning back was no longer possible. Choosing to stand is one thing. Choosing how to stand is another. Kaipkire understood that resistance did not begin with weapons or numbers. It began with a moral line, drawn clearly enough that others could see it and decide where they stood. She was not interested in chaos. She was interested in refusal. Refusal to accept that dignity could be negotiated away, piece by piece. The choice before her was brutally simple. Remain quiet and preserve what safety still existed, knowing it would shrink further with time. Or speak and act, knowing that doing so would invite danger, not only to herself, but to those who chose to stand beside her. This was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between fear and responsibility. Kaipkire knew that once she spoke openly, she would be watched. Once she moved, she would be judged. Once she gathered others, she would be blamed for whatever followed. History is unforgiving to those who interrupt its momentum. It demands courage without promising mercy. And yet, she also knew something else. If no one drew a line, the erosion would continue until nothing recognizable remained. The children would inherit obedience instead of memory. They would learn to adapt to injustice rather than question it. And they would be told that this was simply the way things had always been. That future was unacceptable to her. So Kaipkire chose to lead. Not because she believed herself superior, but because leadership was the burden left behind when too many others stepped away. She spoke to women first, not to exclude men, but because women had already been carrying the consequences of change in their bodies, their homes, and their silence. She did not promise victory. She promised honesty. She promised that fear would no longer be disguised as wisdom. She promised that standing together, even briefly, mattered more than surviving alone for a little longer. She promised that their children would know that someone had tried. This choice reshaped everything. Women who had been expected to endure quietly began to see themselves as guardians of the future. Their presence alone challenged the idea that resistance belonged only to men or to warriors trained from birth. It reminded the world that when survival itself is threatened, courage does not ask permission. Kaipkire's decision was not about defeating an enemy. It was about refusing to disappear. From that moment forward, the struggle was no longer theoretical. It had faces, it had voices, it had women who stood where they had been told to step back. And that, in itself, was an act of defiance the world could no longer ignore. When women step into the center of history, the world is forced to adjust its expectations. Kaipkire did not need to declare what her leadership meant. Its meaning was visible in who stood beside her. Women who had been taught that endurance was their only role now occupied space that had never been offered to them. They did not ask for permission. They understood that history rarely grants it. Their presence alone disrupted the story being told about them. For generations, strength had been narrowly defined. Power was expected to be loud, male, and sanctioned by outsiders. Kaipkire and the women who stood with her challenged that definition without speeches or explanations. They demonstrated that courage could be quiet, disciplined, and deeply rooted in responsibility rather than dominance. This shift unsettled everyone. Those who opposed them underestimated them. Those who watched from a distance struggled to categorize them. And those within the community were forced to confront a question they had avoided for too long: if women were willing to stand in defense of dignity, what excuse remained for anyone else to stay silent? Kaipkire did not frame this movement as a reversal of roles. She framed it as a return to balance. Women were not stepping out of place. They were stepping back into a role that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for a moment when it could no longer remain hidden. The impact of this choice reached far beyond any single confrontation. It reshaped how children understood strength. It reshaped how elders understood continuity. It reshaped how the community imagined its own future. Resistance was no longer an abstract idea, discussed in whispers. It had faces. It had bodies. It had women who stood where they had been told they did not belong. Kaipkire's leadership was not defined by commands shouted across open ground. It was defined by example, by the steady refusal to step aside, by the willingness to absorb risk so that others could find their courage. This was not a momentary uprising. It was a reorientation. The world could no longer pretend that African women were passive witnesses to history. They were participants. They were protectors. They were, when necessary, the line that could not be crossed. And once that truth had been made visible, it could not be unseen. Every act of resistance carries a cost, but the heaviest costs are rarely the ones seen from a distance. For Kaipkire, the price of standing tall did not end with confrontation. It followed her into the quiet spaces where leaders are most alone. The safety of ordinary life slipped away. Every decision carried consequences. Every movement was measured by others. The freedom to be unnoticed, to be simply a woman among her people, was gone. There were losses that history does not record. moments of rest interrupted by vigilance, trust complicated by necessity, relationships strained by fear and misunderstanding. When a person becomes a symbol, even love becomes cautious. People look at you not only as who you are, but as what you represent, and that distance can be painful. Kaipkire accepted this without complaint. She understood that leadership often requires absorbing what others cannot. Doubt, blame, the quiet resentment of those who wish the world had remained simpler. Some would later say she moved too quickly. Others would say she went too far. Very few would say they were willing to take her place. The danger was real, but the isolation was deeper. To stand against powerful forces is one kind of courage. To continue standing when recognition fades is another. Kaipkire faced the possibility that even her sacrifices might be folded into vague memory, stripped of detail, or attributed to others more comfortable for history to name. This was the cost she had always known was possible. She did not fight for certainty. She fought for integrity. She accepted that her name might be blurred while her choices remained sharp, that her life might become a footnote while her posture shaped the path ahead. For many listening today, especially those who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat, this cost feels familiar. There are people who stood so others could walk more freely, yet never received thanks. People who lost opportunities, safety, or peace so that the next generation would inherit something sturdier than silence. The reward was not applause, but continuity. Kaipkire belonged to that lineage. She paid the price, not because she believed it would be repaid, but because some debts must be paid forward. The cost of standing tall is real, but so is the cost of never standing at all. Some legacies do not announce themselves with monuments or written records. They move quietly, carried by memory rather than stone. After the noise of resistance fades, what remains is often subtle. A change in posture, a refusal that lingers in how people speak to one another, a boundary that is remembered even when it is no longer defended with force. This was the kind of legacy Kaipkire left behind. Her name did not dominate official accounts. Her story was not carefully preserved by those who recorded events for power. And yet, something unmistakable endured. Women remembered. They remembered that there was a time when standing back had been the expectation, and a moment when that expectation was broken. They remembered that courage did not always wear armor, and leadership did not always come with permission. Those memories were passed quietly, from mother to daughter, from elder to child, not as commands, but as examples. This is how spiritual inheritance works. It does not rely on approval. It survives through repetition, through the quiet confidence of knowing that someone before you refused to disappear. Long after the immediate struggle ended, the presence of women in moments of resistance no longer felt strange. It felt grounded, familiar, earned. Kaipkire's influence lived on in these shifts, not in the telling of battles, but in the refusal to accept erasure as normal, in the understanding that dignity is not something to be requested. It is something to be practiced, even when the cost is high and the outcome uncertain. For those listening today, this kind of legacy may feel deeply recognizable. Many come from families where strength was never announced, where elders endured, adapted, and protected without expecting recognition, where survival itself was an act of resistance, and memory was the most precious inheritance of all. Kaipkire stands among those ancestors. Her legacy does not ask to be admired. It asks to be remembered correctly, not as a myth, not as an exception, but as proof of something enduring. Proof that when history tries to narrow who is allowed to stand, memory finds a way to widen the ground again. This is the power of a legacy that does not fade. It does not depend on being written down. It depends on being lived. Some people are remembered because history allowed them to be. Others are remembered because forgetting them was never fully possible. Queen Kaipkire belongs to the second kind. She did not leave behind palaces or long written records. What she left behind was far less fragile. She left behind an example of how a human being can stand when standing carries a cost. She showed that leadership is not granted by titles, but claimed through responsibility. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide the future. She made choices that were not safe. She chose not to stay silent when silence was rewarded. She chose to step forward when stepping back would have preserved comfort. She chose to accept isolation so that dignity would not disappear quietly. And she chose to trust that even if her name faded, her posture would not. For those listening today, especially those who have lived long enough to see how easily stories are bent or erased, her life carries a quiet challenge. What do we pass on? Do we pass on caution, dressed as wisdom, or memory shaped by courage? Do we teach the next generation how to survive by shrinking, or how to live by standing tall when it matters most? Queen Kaipkire does not demand admiration. She asks something harder. She asks to be remembered accurately, as part of a long line of African history that has always included women who refused to disappear. Women whose strength did not need permission, and whose sacrifices were not made for recognition, but for continuity. In the world of history legends, her story may appear incomplete. In the realm of historical facts, her name may be brief or uncertain, but memory does not depend on completeness. It depends on truth, carried forward by those who choose not to forget. This is why stories like hers matter, whether they are told aloud, whispered at night, or revisited as history for sleep by those seeking connection rather than spectacle. They remind us that Black history is not only a record of suffering, but a record of choice, posture, and unbroken dignity. Queen Kaipkire may have been pushed to the edges of written history, but she was never pushed out of the story itself. And as long as we continue to tell it, to remember not just what happened, but how someone chose to stand, she remains exactly where she has always been, standing